A black truck screeched to a stop outside Keanu Reeves' new youth center in Mexico. Masked men stepped out, their tattoos glinting under the sunday. One warned, "You're not welcome here." Keanu didn't move. He simply said, "If helping them is a crime, I'll stay guilty." What happened next silenced an entire cartel and inspired the world. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning air over Tijuana was cold and dry, carrying the scent of dust and gasoline. A faint orange light rose over the hills, glinting off the tin rooftops of the barrio. Keanu Reeves stood quietly outside a half-built complex that looked more like a forgotten warehouse than a future center of hope. The walls were rough, covered with fresh paint and bright murals of white doves that shimmered against the metal fences. It wasn't much yet, but to him, it was a beginning. He adjusted the brim of his faded cap, his hands smudged with dried plaster. Around him, a few young men swept debris and stacked bricks. Their laughter echoed through the empty courtyard, blending with the distant hum of city traffic. The sign above the entrance wasn't up yet, but in his notebook, Keanu had already written the name, Casa Nueva Vida, the house of new life. He looked at the mural again, a dove flying out of broken chains. It had been painted by one of the boys, Mateo, a former gang member who had spent half his life in and out of trouble. The image meant everything to him, to all of them. It meant change was possible. Then came the sound, a deep, low growl of an engine tearing through the quiet. The workers stopped, tools dropped, heads turned toward the road that led to the gate. Dust lifted as a black pickup truck sped toward them, its tires screeching as it came to a stop just a few feet from the fence. The laughter died instantly. The truck doors opened. 4 men stepped out, hard eyes, tattooed arms, hands resting on their belts. The kind of men who carried danger like a second skin. One wore a red bandana around his neck, his shirt unbuttoned to reveal a chest inked with gang emblems. Another had a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The youngest looked barely 20, but the coldness in his stare said he'd seen too much. Keanu didn't move. He knew this moment might come. Ever since word spread that an American actor had opened a rehabilitation center for ex-gang members, tension had been building. Some people called it brave, others called it foolish, but the cartels called it interference. The leader stepped forward, boots crunching against the gravel. His voice was sharp, heavy with contempt. "You're not welcome here, Hollywood," he said in Spanish, the accent thick and threatening. "You don't know this land. You don't belong here." Keanu met his eyes calmly. "I'm not here for attention," he said quietly. "I'm here for them." He nodded toward the young men behind him, boys who had once served men like the one standing before him. A tense silence filled the air. The older gang member smirked, circling the gate slowly. "You think you can save them?" he mocked. "They don't need saving, they need loyalty." Keanu didn't respond right away. The wind stirred the dust, lifting loose papers into the air. His voice came steady and even. "Loyalty to what?" he asked. "Fear?" The man's jaw tightened. His hand moved closer to his waistband. The workers began to back away, eyes wide. Keanu took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He wasn't armed. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply stood there, a quiet figure of resolve in front of a half-built dream. "If helping them off the streets is a crime," he said softly, "then I'll stay guilty." The gang members exchanged glances. The younger one, the one with hesitation in his eyes, looked at Keanu for a long second. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, doubt, maybe even admiration. But the older man barked something sharp in Spanish and jerked his head toward the truck. The younger one looked down and followed. The engine roared again. The truck backed up slowly, leaving behind a cloud of dust that covered the murals. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Keanu stayed still until the sound faded into the distance. Then he turned toward the boys standing behind him. "Back to work," he said gently. "We still have walls to build. Mateo stared at him, voice trembling. "They'll come back." Keanu nodded. "Maybe," he said. "But so will we." He picked up a paintbrush lying near his feet and pressed it into Mateo's hand. "You stopped halfway," he said, pointing to the mural. "Finish it." Mateo swallowed hard, then nodded. The others slowly returned to their tasks, their fears slowly replaced by something stronger. Not courage yet, but belief. The sun rose higher, warming the cold cement. Keanu stood quietly, looking toward the road where the truck had disappeared. Deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. He took a deep breath, brushed the dust from his hands, and whispered to himself, "If they test our purpose, we'll answer with compassion." The camera would have lingered on his face there, the quiet strength, the unspoken defiance, the light catching in his eyes. A man unarmed, but unbreakable. This was how revolutions began. Not with weapons, but with one act of unwavering kindness, standing firm against fear. The hours that followed felt longer than the entire morning. The tension never really left the air. Every time a truck passed on the nearby road, the boys glanced toward the gate, half expecting the same men to return. But Keanu moved calmly among them, checking on their work, steadying the rhythm of the day. His presence alone seemed to push fear back into the shadows. He joined Mateo by the mural again. The boy's hand trembled as he painted the last curve of a dove's wing. "I don't understand," Mateo whispered. "Why didn't you call the police? They could have hurt you." Keanu looked at the unfinished wall, his tone calm and reflective. "If we build this place with fear, it'll never stand," he said. "We don't fight them, we outlast them." The paintbrush froze midair. Mateo glanced at him, uncertain whether to admire or question the man who faced gangsters with nothing but words. But Keanu's eyes, clear, steady, kind, left no room for doubt. "Courage isn't noise," he added quietly. "It's staying when everyone else runs." A cool wind swept through the courtyard. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly from the burned trash nearby, a reminder of what surrounded them. Yet for the first time that morning, the boys started talking again, softly, nervously, but with a kind of fragile hope. One of them muttered, "If they come back, we'll protect this place." Keanu turned to him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No," he said. "We'll protect each other. That's the difference." The young men looked at one another, understanding slowly, settling in. And above them, the sunlight caught the wet paint on the dove's wings, making it glow white against the gray wall like a living thing. By late afternoon, the rhythm of work returned. The steady clang of metal tools replaced the morning silence. Keanu carried planks of wood across the courtyard, his movements patient and deliberate. The young men followed his lead, slowly, forgetting the sound of that truck's engine. Each swing of a hammer felt like reclaiming ground that fear had tried to steal. A small radio played a local ballad from the workshop window. Its melody drifted through the yard, warm and gentle. Keanu paused to listen, then said softly, "Music builds. Things too." The boys smiled faintly, the tension melting a little more. When the last light of day fell on the walls, Mateo approached with a question still burning in his chest. "Why you?" he asked. "Why would a man like you care what happens to kids like us?" Keanu leaned against the frame of a doorway, his voice low. "Because someone once cared when I didn't deserve it either." Mateo didn't answer. He just nodded, quietly taking in the weight of those words. Around them, the sky turned orange and pink, reflecting off the wet paint of the mural. The doves looked as if they were flying out of fire into freedom. Keanu took one last look toward the distant road. No more trucks, no more threats. Just the hum of life beginning again inside the walls of a dream still under construction. "Tomorrow," he said, breaking the quiet, "we finish the roof." Mateo smiled faintly. "And if they come back?" Keanu's expression didn't change. "Then we show them what strength really looks like." As darkness settled, the first lights of Casa Nueva Vida flickered on, fragile, steady, and unafraid. 6 months earlier, the desert sun was merciless over the set of a film called The Borderline. It was one of those gritty action dramas about crime and survival near the Mexican frontier. Cameras rolled, explosions thundered, and extras in ragged clothes ran through dusty streets as sirens wailed in the distance. Between takes, Keanu Reeves would step away from the chaos of lights and cables, finding shade beneath a makeshift canopy. He wasn't thinking about the next scene. He was watching the faces around him. Many of the extras were local kids hired for realism, thin, sunburned, carrying an exhaustion that didn't come from acting. He noticed how some of them avoided eye contact, how their laughter sounded forced, as if it had been trained to hide fear. One afternoon, the director called for a break. Keanu took a bottle of water and walked toward a small group of teens sitting by the fence. They had tattoos crawling up their necks and arms, symbols of local gangs. A few looked no older than 16. "You were good out there," Keanu said in Spanish. The boys shrugged, surprised that the star of the movie spoke to them directly. One of them, a wiry kid with tired eyes and a scar near his lip, smiled faintly. "It's not hard to act scared," he said. "We've been doing that our whole lives." The others laughed, but there was no joy in it. Keanu crouched beside them. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mateo," the boy replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. Keanu handed him the water bottle. "How old are you, Mateo?" 14 when I joined. 19 now." His tone was flat, as if reciting a fact too familiar to sting anymore. "Joined what?" Keanu asked, already knowing the answer. Mateo lifted his sleeve, showing a faded tattoo shaped like a broken blade. "There was nothing else," he said simply. "No work, no school. Just them." He nodded toward the horizon, where police sirens echoed faintly. Keanu sat in silence for a moment. The boys' words hit harder than any line in the script. Around them, the crew prepared for another take, oblivious to the quiet truth unfolding behind the set. Mateo looked up suddenly. "You think your movie will change anything?" The question hung in the dry air. Keanu didn't rush to answer. "Maybe not the world," he said, "but maybe someone watching will think before they pick up a gun." Mateo's eyes softened. "We don't need movies," he murmured. "We need chances." The line stayed with Keanu long after the director shouted for cameras to roll again. As he walked back toward the set, the heat rising off the asphalt blurred his vision, and he found himself thinking not about acting, but about the lives just outside the frame. That night, in his trailer, he wrote one sentence in his notebook. "If we want peace, we must build it." Filming continued for weeks. Each day brought new scenes of gunfire, betrayal, and border chases. The story was fiction, but the world around them wasn't. Keanu began to notice the thin line between the movie set and real life. The same police sirens they used as sound effects echoed for real in the distance every night. During breaks, he made a habit of sitting with the extras again. Some opened up, cautiously at first. They talked about how the gangs found them when no one else did. One boy said his father was killed when he tried to leave. Another admitted he joined for food, just food. Keanu didn't interrupt. He just listened, quietly, the way someone listens when their heart already knows the answer. One afternoon, Mateo came back with a small plastic bag filled with hand-carved trinkets. He shyly offered one to Keanu, a wooden dove, roughly shaped, with a crack down one wing. "Made it in jail," he said. "They let us do crafts sometimes." Keanu turned the carving over in his hand, the texture rough against his skin. "Why a dove?" he asked. Mateo shrugged. "My mom used to say doves don't fight back, they just keep flying." That sentence hit Keanu like a wave. He placed the carving carefully in his pocket, as if it were made of glass. That night, back in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. The luxury felt wrong. The soft bed, the air conditioning, the silence. He got up and looked out over the city lights, thinking of the boys sleeping on rooftops or alleys below. His phone buzzed. It was an email from his agent in Los Angeles, new scripts, new offers, new blockbusters. But his attention stayed on that one line in his notebook. "If we want peace, we must build it." The next morning, between takes, the director approached him. "You okay, Keanu? You seem distracted." "I'm just thinking." Keanu said softly. About what happens when we shout cut and go home, the director chuckled. That's not our problem, my friend. That's real life. Keanu nodded, but in his heart, the words didn't sit right. Maybe it was his problem. Maybe that's why he couldn't stop thinking about it. When the final scene wrapped, the cast and crew gathered to celebrate. Laughter filled the air. But Keanu stood apart, watching Mateo wave from a distance, surrounded by the same boys he'd met weeks before. They were smiling for now, but he knew what waited for them outside those fences. As he walked to his car, he reached into his pocket and felt the carved dove again. He looked back at the dusty set and whispered under his breath, "There has to be more I can do." 2 days later, Keanu boarded a flight back to Los Angeles. As the plane climbed above the desert, he looked out the window at the vast stretch of brown and gold below. From up there, the border looked invisible, just one endless piece of earth. Yet down there it divided lives, dreams, and choices. He pulled the small wooden dove from his pocket and turned it in his hands. Its cracked wing caught the morning light. A flight attendant stopped beside him, smiling. "That's beautiful," she said. "Did you make it?" Keanu shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "A boy did. One who shouldn't have had to." When she moved on, he sat back and stared at the empty seat beside him. The hum of the engines faded under the noise in his mind. Mateo's voice replayed over and over. "We don't need movies. We need chances." By the time the plane landed, the idea had taken shape. He wasn't thinking about another role or another award. He was thinking about how to give those boys a life beyond survival. Not charity, not a photo op, but something real. Something that would last. In Los Angeles, his manager greeted him with good news. A new offer, a potential franchise, interviews lined up for the film's release. But Keanu's attention drifted. "I'll take some time off," he said. "A few months, maybe longer." His manager frowned. "You're at your peak right now. Everyone's talking about your performance. Why disappear?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Because sometimes the best stories aren't on screen." Over the next few weeks, he began quietly researching. He met with community leaders, psychologists, and reformed gang members in East LA. He listened to their experiences, learning what programs failed and which ones saved lives. Every conversation led back to one truth: people changed when someone believed in them long enough to prove they could. Late one evening, as he walked along Venice Beach, the decision became clear. He would go back to Mexico, not to film, but to build. He envisioned a place where young men could learn skills instead of violence, art instead of fear, compassion instead of revenge. A place with real walls, open doors, and second chances. He called it Casa Nueva Vida, the house of new life. The next morning, he called Mateo. The number was written on a scrap of paper from the set. When the boy answered, his voice was wary. "It's Keanu," he said. "Remember that dove you gave me?" A long pause. Then Mateo's voice softened. "Yeah, I'm coming back," Keanu said. "And when I do, I'll need your help." On the other end, Mateo didn't speak for several seconds. Then, quietly, "You're serious?" "As serious as that cracked wing," Keanu replied. "We're going to fix it together." He hung up and looked toward the sunrise breaking through the Los Angeles skyline. For the first time in months, he felt something solid purpose. When Keanu returned to Mexico, the air was heavier than he remembered. The roads outside Mexicali stretched wide and cracked beneath the desert heat. Dust swirled with every passing truck. He drove an old pickup himself this time. No film crew, no assistants, no publicity. Just him, a small notebook on the passenger seat, and a plan that felt bigger than anything he had ever done on screen. He had found the place through a local charity worker, a long-abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. The building looked half-forgotten, its metal doors rusted, graffiti covering the walls, broken glass glittering in the sunlight. Most people saw ruin. Keanu saw possibility. He parked, stepped out, and ran his hand along the rough brick. The smell of oil, dust, and old iron filled the air. He could almost hear the echoes of engines from years ago when the warehouse had been a repair shop. Now, it would become something else. a place for rebuilding people instead of machines. He walked through the empty halls, light streaming through holes in the roof, forming shifting shapes on the floor. He took out his notebook and wrote 3 words in big letters across the first page: Casa Nueva Vida. The next morning, he met with a local carpenter named Luis and a few volunteers from the neighborhood. They eyed him with polite suspicion at first. A movie star wanting to build a community center sounded like another story that would fade as soon as cameras stopped rolling. But Keanu didn't talk much. He listened, nodded, and got to work. When the others started hauling wood, he grabbed a shovel. When they began sanding walls, he climbed a ladder and painted beside them. Sweat rolled down his face as he brushed layers of white over the graffiti. By noon, he had paint splatters across his clothes, a streak on his cheek, and a quiet smile that said he was exactly where he wanted to be. Luis watched him from across the room, shaking his head. "You're not like the others," he muttered. In Spanish. Keanu chuckled. "I hope not," he replied. His accent was broken, his words careful, but his sincerity was clear. During lunch, they sat on overturned buckets, sharing tortillas and beans wrapped in foil. Keanu tried a local street taco for the first time and laughed when the salsa burned his tongue. The workers laughed with him, the sound echoing off the hollow walls. For the first time that day, they stopped calling him El Actor and started calling him Amigo. By evening, when the sun dipped below the rooftops, he stood outside the warehouse, now partly cleaned, the dust settling around him like mist. The walls still looked rough, but the energy inside had shifted. He whispered to himself, "It's beginning." And somewhere inside that broken building, hope took its first breath. The days that followed turned into a rhythm of work and humility. Keanu woke before sunrise and drove through the quiet streets of Mexicali, the sky still gray and cool. By the time the others arrived, he was already there, sweeping dust from the entrance or unloading bricks from the back of his truck. Word began to spread the actor had returned, and he was working with his own hands. Luis, the carpenter, watched him carefully. He'd seen well-meaning outsiders come and go before charities, politicians, even church groups. But this one was different. Keanu didn't give speeches. He didn't hand out money and disappear. He hauled wood, learned to mix cement, and struggled through Spanish instructions with a patient smile. When Luis teased him for pronouncing martillo wrong, Keanu laughed and repeated it until he got it right. At lunchtime, they ate together under a patched-up awning, passing around tacos and bottles of water. Keanu listened more than he spoke, asking questions about their families, their work, their lives. The more he listened, the more they began to trust him. He wasn't a celebrity to them anymore. He was just a man building something that mattered. One afternoon, as the workers packed up, an older woman from the neighborhood approached the site. Her name was Rosa. She ran a small food stall nearby and had been watching from across the street for days. "Señor Reeves," she called softly, "they say you're building a place for the lost boys." Keanu wiped sweat from his forehead. "For anyone who wants to start again," he said. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll need food. These boys will eat like wolves." The next day, Rosa brought pots of stew and fresh tortillas, enough to feed everyone. Her gesture broke the final wall of doubt. Soon, other locals began to stop by, curious at first, then willing to help. A man lent his truck. A teenager offered to paint. A priest donated tools from the church basement. One evening, while cleaning brushes, Luis asked, "Why here, Keanu? You could build a center in Los Angeles. Safer, easier." Keanu thought for a moment before answering, "Because here they need someone who doesn't give up on them. They've heard promises before. I want them to see that someone kept one." Luis nodded slowly, saying nothing more. By the third week, the building had started to change. The walls were repainted white, the roof patched, and a sign with hand-carved letters stood near the gate, Casa Nueva Vida. Every letter was uneven, but that made it perfect. It wasn't polished, it was real. When the sun set that evening, the last light fell across the courtyard, where laughter echoed for the first time in years. Keanu stood beside Louise, watching the scene quietly. "It's not finished," Louise said. Keanu smiled. "Neither are they." By the end of the first month, the old warehouse had begun to look alive again. The smell of paint replaced rust, and the sound of hammers replaced silence. Each nail driven into the wall seemed to erase a piece of the building's past. Keanu worked shoulder to shoulder with the others, his shirt stained, his hands calloused, his voice hoarse from laughter and long hours under the sundae. One morning, a local reporter arrived with a small camera crew. They asked if they could film a short piece for the evening news. Keanu hesitated. He hadn't wanted attention, but Louise persuaded him. "People should see what's happening," he said. "Maybe they'll believe it's real." When the camera started rolling, Keanu spoke simply, standing in front of the half-finished doorway. "This place isn't about charity," he said. "It's about giving young people a chance to build something with their own hands. When you build, you learn your worth." That night, the short clip aired on local television. The next day, a few new faces appeared at the gate, curious young men from nearby neighborhoods, some with tattoos like Mateo's, others just looking for a place to belong. They watched from a distance as Keanu carried wood and painted over graffiti. Finally, one called out, "You really work here?" Keanu smiled. "Every day. You want to help?" The boy shrugged, pretending not to care, but stepped forward anyway. That single step changed everything. Within weeks, Casa Nueva Vida had more volunteers than tools to give them. Still, not everyone believed. Some locals muttered that it was all for publicity. Others said it wouldn't last, that the gangs would burn it down. Keanu heard the whispers, but he didn't respond. He just kept showing up, every morning before dawn. He began to pick up Spanish faster, his sentences growing smoother. When someone dropped a heavy beam, he'd joke, "Más cuidado, por favor," and the men would laugh. At lunch, he'd tell stories about growing up without much, about loss, and how kindness had once saved him. Those moments of honesty dissolved whatever distance remained. One evening, after a long day of work, Mateo finally arrived. He had kept his promise. When he walked through the gate, Keanu looked up from a paint can and smiled. "You came," he said. Mateo nodded. "I told you I would." Keanu handed him a brush. "Then let's make this place shine." They painted side by side until the last light faded. As the others packed up, Mateo stared at the white wall in front of him. "It looks different," he said softly. Keanu looked at him and replied, "So do you." That night, when everyone left, Keanu stayed behind. He stood in the middle of the quiet courtyard, the smell of fresh paint in the air, and whispered, "This is what second chances sound like." Outside, the desert wind carried his words into the dark, fragile but unbreakable. It began quietly one morning. Two unfamiliar figures appeared at the gate. They looked uncertain, their clothes worn, their expressions caught between suspicion and pride. Word had spread through the neighborhoods that the actor in Mexicali was opening a center for lost youth. Most people didn't believe it, but curiosity had a way of moving faster than fear. Keanu saw them first. He set down a box of supplies and walked to the gate, wiping dust from his hands. "Buenos dias," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. The older of the two, maybe 20, crossed his arms. "You really him?" he asked in English with a heavy accent. Keanu nodded. "Only on weekends," he said lightly. And the joke broke a bit of the tension. "You here to work?" The younger one, thin and restless, shifted his weight. "Maybe," he said. "They said you pay." Keanu shook his head. "No pay, but you'll earn skills, food, and respect." They exchanged glances. It wasn't what they expected. He opened the gate anyway. "Come in. Let's start." Inside, the warehouse had transformed since the early days. There were 3 separate areas: a small workshop with tools and engines lined up against one wall, a bakery setup donated by Rosa, and a corner stage with old theater curtains hung from pipes. The words Casa Nueva Vida were painted across the main hall in large blue letters. The boys looked around uncertainly. Keanu watched their eyes, saw the flicker of hope buried beneath years of mistrust. "Here," he said, handing them gloves. "You can help fix an old car, or bake bread. Or, if you'd rather, we have acting lessons on Fridays." The older one laughed under his breath. "Acting?" Keanu nodded seriously. "It helps people find their voice again." They didn't know what to say. In that silence, Mateo appeared from the back room. He had grown more confident in the weeks since his return, still cautious, but different. When he saw the new arrivals, he smiled and nodded. "You're in the right place," he said. By the end of the day, 3 more young men had arrived. Friends of friends, drawn by curiosity. Some carried nothing but the clothes they wore. One came with his sister, who refused to leave until she saw Keanu promise he'd keep her brother safe. He did. That night, the courtyard buzzed with noise. The air smelled of oil, flour, and something new possibility. Yet beneath the laughter, tension simmered. Some of the newcomers didn't trust the rules. A few whispered in corners, testing boundaries. Mateo noticed, but said nothing. He knew change never came clean. When darkness fell, Keanu stood by the mural of the doves, watching the flicker of lights inside the building. He didn't need perfection. He needed beginnings. He whispered softly, "Let's give them a reason to stay." By the second day, the calm had turned to chaos. The new arrivals didn't understand discipline yet. One group fought over tools in the workshop, another mocked the acting exercises, and someone sprayed fresh graffiti across the wall that had taken weeks to clean. Luis found it early in the morning and stormed into the courtyard, angry. "They don't care, Keanu," he said sharply. "You give them a home and they spit on it." Keanu didn't argue. He looked at the red paint dripping from the wall, then at the young men standing nearby, pretending not to notice. "It's not the wall," he said softly. "It's what's still painted inside them." He called everyone together that afternoon. They gathered in the courtyard, leaning against the pillars and folding their arms, waiting for the punishment they expected. Instead, Keanu handed out rags, buckets, and soap. "We're cleaning this together," he said calmly. "Not because I said so, but because this wall belongs to all of us." A few of them scoffed. One muttered, "We didn't come here to be janitors." Keanu nodded. "Then tell me what you came for." No one answered. The silence stretched long until Mateo stepped forward. "He's right," he said. "We keep waiting for someone to change our lives, but we never clean our own mess. That broke something in the air." Slowly, one by one, they began to scrub. The red paint bled into the water, turning it pink, then pale. When they finished, Keanu dipped a brush in white paint and handed it to the youngest boy. "Your turn," he said. The boy hesitated. "What do I paint?" "Something you'd rather see," Keanu replied. The boy thought for a moment, then began to draw shaky outlines of wings. The others gathered around, watching as the shape of a dove appeared again on the wall. No one spoke until it was done. That evening, Rosa arrived with trays of bread, the smell drifting through the air. "You worked hard today," she said with a warm smile. The boys devoured everything, laughing with flour still on their fingers. Later, when the others went to rest, Keanu sat with Mateo near the mural, the moonlight reflecting off the fresh paint. "You handled that well," Keanu said. "You're becoming a leader." Mateo shook his head. "I just remembered what it felt like when no one believed I could change." Keanu looked at the dove on the wall. "Then make sure they never forget that feeling." The sounds of the city faded around them, replaced by quiet voices and the scrape of brushes cleaning for the next day. Inside the warehouse, light glowed through the windows like a heartbeat, fragile but alive. And for the first time, the place didn't just look like a center, it felt like home. By the end of the first week, the routine began to form. The mornings started early, with sweeping, cleaning, and breakfast from Rosa's kitchen. Keanu joined them for every meal, sitting on the same benches, eating the same food, no separation between teacher and student. He greeted each one by name, remembering their faces, their stories, and what brought them there. To him, they weren't criminals or failures. They were people beginning again. Still, not every day went smoothly. A wrench went missing from the workshop. Someone blamed someone else. Voices rose. One of the boys, a tall teenager named Diego, shoved another hard enough to knock over a bucket of oil. Luis moved to intervene, but Keanu stepped between them first. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his expression calm but firm. "This isn't a prison," he said evenly. "You can leave if you want, but if you stay, you learn that strength isn't about who yells louder." The room went quiet. Diego's breathing slowed, his fists unclenched. The other boy stepped back, embarrassed. Without another word, Keanu picked up a rag and began wiping the spilled oil from the floor. After a long pause, Diego knelt to help. Then the others did too. Later, Mateo found Keanu sitting outside, looking tired but peaceful. "You never get angry," Mateo said. "Even when you should." Keanu smiled faintly. "Anger builds walls," he said. "I'd rather build doors." Those words spread among the students faster than any rule. The next morning, when another argument broke out, Mateo repeated them. By the end of the week, the tone had changed. The boys still tested boundaries, but less out of defiance and more from confusion about a world that didn't punish them for every mistake. To channel their energy, Keanu created new classes mechanics in the morning, baking in the afternoon, and acting lessons before sunset. At first, they laughed at the idea of performing. But when Keanu showed them how a scene could tell a story about redemption, even the toughest ones listened. During one lesson, he told them, "The hardest role you'll ever play is yourself after you change." They didn't laugh that time. They just looked at him, quiet and thoughtful. That weekend, Rosa brought her young grandson to visit. The boy was fascinated by the murals, especially the doves. When he pointed to one and asked who painted it, Diego answered softly, "We did." His voice carried both pride and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe the words were his own. That night, Keanu walked through the sleeping courtyard, the sound of crickets echoing under the stars. He stopped by the gate, touching the cool metal where the paint had dried. The chaos of the week still echoed faintly in his mind, but so did the laughter, the effort, and the small victories. "I see people," he whispered into the dark, "not problems." And somewhere behind him, in that once broken warehouse, hope continued to rebuild itself, one heart at a time. The following week, Keanu introduced something new. He called everyone into the courtyard one morning, where the sunlight touched the whitewashed walls and the faint smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. The boys gathered slowly, some still wiping flour from their hands, others coming straight from the workshop. Mateo stood at the front, curious. Keanu faced them, holding a paintbrush. "I want to show you something," he said. "This wall behind me, this will be our wall of trust. Every time someone finishes their program here, they'll paint a dove and write a message of hope. It doesn't matter how small, it just has to be honest." The group exchanged puzzled looks. One boy laughed nervously. "So, like graffiti? With permission?" Keanu smiled. "Something like that. Except this one doesn't destroy, it builds." He dipped the brush into a can of blue paint and began to draw slow, deliberate lines on the wall. The shape of wings began to appear. "Each dove will be different," he said as he worked, "because each of you will leave your mark in your own way. When you look at this wall, you'll remember that you're not your past. You're part of something growing." When he finished, he stepped back and handed the brush to a boy named Diego. "Your turn," he said. Diego hesitated. "I can't paint." "Neither could I," Keanu said gently. "Start with one color." The boy stared at the brush, then at the blank space beside Keanu's dove. Slowly, he pressed the bristles to the wall. The paint spread unevenly, messy but full of life. When he was done, he wrote one word beneath it, "Familia." The others watched in silence. Then one by one, they began to ask for brushes. Soon, the wall came alive, with color, some doves small and shaky, others large and bold. Each had a word underneath: Perdón, Fe, Cambio. Mateo painted last. His dove was simple, white with a yellow halo, and under it he wrote Seguir, meaning to keep going. Keanu stepped back, his eyes glistening. "That's what this place is about," he said softly. "Not perfection, persistence." That night the wall glowed under the courtyard lights, a mosaic of color against the once blank surface. It wasn't just decoration. It was proof that they were no longer invisible. As the others headed to bed, Mateo lingered by his dove. He touched the edge of the paint, his expression thoughtful. "I never painted anything before," he admitted quietly. Keanu handed him the brush again. "Then start with one color," he repeated with a smile. "You'll be surprised where it takes you." Mateo nodded, and for the first time in years, he looked peaceful. The wall soon became the heart of Casa Nueva Vida. Every morning before work, the boys passed it on their way to the workshop or the bakery. Some touched their painted doves for luck. Others just stared quietly before starting their day. It reminded them that they belonged to something that wouldn't vanish when the day ended. Keanu noticed the change slowly but clearly. The fights grew fewer. The laughter grew louder. The building, once filled with echoes of defiance, now hummed with purpose. The same hands that had once carried weapons now held paintbrushes, wrenches, or rolling pins. In the evenings, Keanu joined them for meals. He never sat at a separate table. Rosa always made sure there was enough for everyone: chicken stew, tortillas, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. The boys teased him about his Spanish, and he played along, learning their slang, repeating it until they laughed so hard they forgot who they used to be. One night, while everyone ate in the courtyard, Diego asked, "Why do you do this? You could be anywhere in the world, and you're here with us." Keanu thought for a moment before answering, "Because I know what it's like to lose something and need a hand to stand again. I just want to be that hand for someone else." The group went silent, the air thick with understanding. Then Mateo broke the tension by tossing Keanu a piece of bread. "Then eat, boss. The hand's gonna get hungry." Laughter erupted again, and the heaviness dissolved. Later that night, as the others cleaned up, Mateo and Keanu worked together on an old car in the corner of the courtyard. The engine had belonged to a man who donated it as scrap, but Keanu insisted they could fix it. As they worked, Mateo glanced at the wall. "When we paint those doves," he said, "it feels like we're erasing something." Keanu looked up from the engine. "Not erasing," he said softly. "Replacing." Mateo nodded slowly, understanding the difference. For him, that wall wasn't just a symbol, it was therapy, forgiveness, and a mirror of their growth. Every stroke of color carried a story of a boy learning to believe again. Later that week, a local schoolteacher visited to see the center. She stood before the wall and said it looked like a choir of hope. Her words reached the boys like a blessing. From that day, they began calling it El Muro de Fe, the Wall of Faith. That evening, Keanu added his own dove, small, quiet, almost hidden among the rest. Beneath it, he wrote 2 words in Spanish: Todavía creemos. We still believe. It wasn't about leadership anymore. It was about unity. Weeks passed, and the wall kept growing. New students arrived, each carrying their own stories, scars, and hesitations. Keanu greeted them all the same way, with a handshake, a meal, and a brush waiting at the ready. When they asked why, he told them, "Because you can't start new until you leave something behind." That line became the unofficial motto of Casa Nueva Vida. Some nights, after everyone was asleep, Keanu would walk alone through the courtyard. The moonlight illuminated the painted doves, casting long shadows across the wall. Every color told a story: red for courage, blue for forgiveness, green for hope. He'd run his fingers lightly over the rough surface, feeling the layers of paint like the layers of lives being rebuilt. During one of those quiet walks, he noticed Mateo sitting by the mural, still awake. The boy was holding a paintbrush, staring at a blank spot near the edge. "Couldn't sleep?" Keanu asked gently. Mateo shook his head. "I was thinking about my mom," he said. She always told me I'd end up like my father. I used to hate her for saying that. But now, I think she just didn't believe people could change. Keanu sat beside him. Then show her that they can, he said. Paint her a dove. Mateo looked down at the wall. After a moment, he began to paint slow, careful strokes, forming a white bird with gold edges. Beneath it, he wrote a single word, Madre. When he finished, he stood back, silent. His hands trembled slightly. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. You didn't paint for her, he said softly. You painted for yourself. Mateo nodded, tears glinting in the dim light. I think, for the first time, I forgive her. That night, word spread about Mateo's dove. The next day, one of the toughest students, a quiet boy named Angel, approached the wall and added his own, a black dove with silver wings. Underneath, he wrote, Perdonate, meaning forgive yourself. That message hit home for everyone who saw it. Soon, the wall wasn't just decoration anymore. It was therapy. When someone struggled or wanted to quit, the others would say, Go look at the wall. It had become their counselor, their diary, their proof that healing was real. Keanu continued working alongside them, helping fix cars, knead dough, and rehearse lines from small plays they performed on Fridays. He laughed easily, failed publicly, and kept showing them that imperfection was part of being human. In those moments, no one saw him as a famous actor. He was just Keanu, the man who believed that every broken life could be rebuilt with patience, kindness, and one color at a time. And as the sun rose over Casa Nueva Vida one morning, its first rays hit the wall of trust, lighting up every painted dove until the entire courtyard shimmered. It looked less like a wall now, and more like a promise. The sound of hope rarely goes unnoticed for long. Within weeks, the growing success of Casa Nueva Vida began to stir unease beyond its walls. The murals, the laughter, the smell of baked bread drifting across the street, it all caught the attention of people who didn't trust change so easily. It started with whispers at the marketplace. Some said Keanu's center was a cover for something else. Others accused him of bringing trouble into the neighborhood. He's gathering criminals under one roof, one vendor muttered to another. Sooner or later, it'll explode. By the end of the month, those whispers reached the city council. A councilman named Ortega, known for his strict policies, demanded an inspection. It's irresponsible, he said at a public meeting. You can't just collect gang members and hope they bake bread instead of trouble. His words echoed across the small community, fueling fear among those who had never set foot inside the center. One afternoon, as Keanu supervised the painting of new shelves in the workshop, 2 government inspectors arrived unannounced. Their suits looked out of place among the noise and dust. Senor Reeves, one said stiffly, we're here to review your activities. Keanu greeted them politely and handed them protective vests. Of course, he said, but if you're here to inspect, you'll need to help. We're short on hands today. The inspectors looked at each other, startled. Within minutes, they found themselves holding clipboards in one hand and paintbrushes in the other. The boys grinned as the men tried to avoid splatters. Mateo whispered to Diego, they'll never forget this. When the tour ended, the inspectors couldn't hide their surprise. The bakery smelled of cinnamon and butter. The workshop buzzed with the hum of engines being repaired. The acting corner was alive with laughter as 2 boys rehearsed a comedy sketch about redemption. One inspector finally said, I expected chaos. Keanu smiled. You found creation instead. Still, outside the center's gates, resistance brewed. Flyers appeared warning residents about a foreign experiment with dangerous youth. Rosa tore one down in anger and brought it to Keanu. They don't see what's happening here, she said, her voice trembling. Keanu studied the flyer for a long moment before folding it neatly. Then we'll show them, he said quietly. He invited local leaders to visit the center the following weekend. Teachers, business owners, even the skeptical councilman Ortega. Invitations went out by hand, each one written with respect and signed simply, Keanu Reeves, Casa Nueva Vida. That night, as the lights dimmed and the courtyard grew quiet, Mateo asked him, "You think they'll come?" Keanu looked toward the wall of doves, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "If we keep building truth," he said, "eventually they'll want to see it." Saturday arrived, hot and bright. The students cleaned every corner of the compound, swept the courtyard, and arranged tables under the shade. Rosa worked all morning preparing trays of bread and stew, her voice rising above the noise as she gave orders like a general. Luis polished the sign at the gate until the carved letters gleamed. By noon, a few visitors began to arrive. Most came cautiously, eyes darting around, unsure what to expect. Ortega, the councilman, walked in with his assistant and a look of guarded disapproval. Behind him came a local priest, Father Ramos, his white collar crisp, his eyes filled with curiosity and worry. Keanu greeted each of them at the entrance with a calm smile and a handshake that felt more like a promise than a greeting. "Welcome to Casa Nueva Vida," he said. "Please, see for yourselves." The guests toured the facilities while the boys continued their work. In the workshop, Diego demonstrated how to rebuild an engine. The visitors watched as he tightened bolts with confidence. "A month ago," Keanu explained, "that same boy couldn't trust anyone enough to ask for help." In the bakery, Rosa handed out warm bread, dusted with sugar. Ortega took a piece reluctantly, but one bite softened his expression. "This is good," he admitted, surprised. "They made it," Rosa said proudly, pointing to the boys behind her. Next, they entered the courtyard, where Mateo and two others were rehearsing a small play they had written. It told the story of two brothers, one who stayed in the gang life, the other who found forgiveness through hard work. The acting was raw and imperfect, but the message was powerful. When the play ended, there was silence before the guests began to clap, hesitant at first, then genuine. Father Ramos turned to Keanu and said quietly, "Forgiveness is noble, but danger is real. These boys could bring violence here." Keanu nodded respectfully. "You're right, Father. But if we keep shutting doors, they'll always go back to where violence waits. The only way to stop it is to open a few." The priest didn't answer right away. He watched the young men laughing as they cleaned up props, their energy light and unguarded. Finally, he said, "Maybe you're opening more than doors." After the tour, the visitors gathered in the courtyard for lunch. The students served food, shy but proud. Conversation slowly turned warm. Ortega spoke with Mateo about his plans to study mechanics. The priest asked Rosa for her bread recipe. When the meal ended, Ortega approached Keanu. "I'll be honest," he said. "I came to find faults. I expected to see broken promises, but I was wrong. This is something different." Keanu extended his hand. Then, "Help us keep it that way." Ortega shook it. "I will." That night, when the guests had gone and the boys were celebrating their success, Mateo looked at Keanu and said, "They believe us now." Keanu smiled faintly. "They believe in you." The success of that visit spread quickly. Within days, newspapers published short articles about Casa Nueva Vida. The headlines read, "Hollywood star builds hope in Mexicali," and "Former gang members find redemption in Reeves' program." People began to talk about the center differently. The tone shifted from fear to curiosity, and sometimes even admiration. But not everyone was pleased. In the darker corners of the city, the cartels had begun to notice the change. Young recruits were leaving the streets. Fewer kids answered when they called. The ones who did were hesitant now, thinking twice before stepping into the same life that had claimed so many before them. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Luis arrived with a worried expression. "Keanu," he said quietly, "I heard something at the market. Some men are saying you're interfering with their business." Keanu put down the wrench he was holding and looked at him calmly. "I expected that," he said. "You can't build light without casting a shadow." Luis frowned. "They don't talk about shadows. They talk about warnings." Keanu took a deep breath, steady but unwavering. "Then we keep working," he said. "We don't fight back. We show them something stronger than fear." That night, he called a meeting with the boys. They gathered in the courtyard. faces tense, the air thick with uncertainty. Keanu didn't hide the truth. "You might hear threats," he said. "Some people won't like what we're doing. But I want you to remember, what we build here isn't against anyone. It's for something. For peace. For second chances." Mateo looked up from his seat. "And if they come for you?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Then I'll invite them in for bread." The group laughed nervously, but the tension eased. Somehow, his calm steadiness gave them courage. The next morning, they returned to work as usual. Engines roared again in the workshop. The smell of flour filled the air, and the wall of doves grew with new colors. Outside, people began to notice something extraordinary. The neighborhood itself was changing. Graffiti was replaced by murals of peace. Kids started showing up at the gate after school, asking if they could watch the acting classes. A local radio station interviewed Rosa, who spoke proudly of the boys who turned the sound of guns into the sound of laughter. Still, Keanu never let success turn into pride. Every evening, he reminded the group why they started. "Hope," he said once, "isn't a gift you keep. It's a job you do every day." Late one night, as the courtyard lights flickered and the city settled into silence, Keanu stood alone by the gate, gazing at the distant lights of Mexicali. The world outside might still doubt him, and danger might still be near. But within these walls, something powerful was taking root, something no threat could erase. He whispered quietly, "They can't stop what's already growing." The warning came on a quiet night. The air was cool, and the courtyard lights flickered softly against the walls of Casa Nueva Vida. Most of the boys were asleep. Only Mateo was still awake, finishing up work on a broken bicycle near the gate. The night felt calm, almost too calm, until he noticed something strange. A folded piece of paper slipped under the door. He picked it up, the edges smudged with dust. The handwriting was rough, angry, written in red ink. It said only 6 words: "Stay out of our business, Hollywood." Mateo froze. He looked toward the dark street beyond the gate but saw nothing except the faint glow of headlights passing in the distance. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper again, reading it twice to be sure. The words felt heavier the second time. He ran to Keanu's room and knocked. A moment later, Keanu opened the door, wearing a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair tousled from sleep. Mateo handed him the note without a word. Keanu read it, his face still in calm. "Who found this?" he asked. "I did," Mateo said. "Just now." Keanu studied the paper in silence, then nodded. "Thank you for bringing it to me." Mateo's voice cracked slightly. "They're serious, Keanu. Maybe we should tell the police." Keanu looked at him gently. "We will, but not out of fear, out of respect for everyone's safety." He folded the paper neatly and placed it on his desk. "Lock the doors for tonight. We'll talk in the morning." The next day, the tension in the center was heavy enough to taste. The news spread fast. Diego paced the workshop, fists clenched. "They think they can scare us," he muttered. "Let them try." Keanu called everyone together in the courtyard. He stood by the mural, the morning light reflecting off the wall of painted doves. "I know you've heard," he began. "Someone wants us to stop. They believe fear can undo what we've built." The group murmured, uneasy. Mateo watched him closely, waiting for what he'd say next. Keanu's voice stayed calm. "Fear wins when good people walk away, and we won't walk away." The words settled over the group like a shield. Even Rosa, standing near the kitchen door, felt her chest tighten. Luis nodded slowly. "So, what do we do?" Keanu glanced around the courtyard. "We stay the same. We work, we learn, we create, but we'll also be smart." He turned toward the gate. "We'll install cameras and better locks. I'll call the authorities to keep an eye on us. But we won't carry weapons. We're not soldiers. We're builders." Some of the boys exchanged worried looks. "But what if they come back?" one asked. Keanu met his eyes. "Then we show them what strength really looks like." That night, the center felt different. The laughter that usually echoed through the halls was replaced by cautious silence. Every sound, the barking dogs, the hum of passing cars, The creak of the gate seemed sharper, louder. The boys pretended not to notice, but the unease was written all over their faces. Even Rosa, who rarely showed fear, lit an extra candle in the kitchen before going to bed. Mateo couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that note. Its message kept repeating in his mind. Stay out of our business. He knew exactly what it meant. The cartels were starting to see Casa Nueva Vida as a threat. Every boy who walked through their gates was one less soldier for the streets. Around midnight, Mateo got up to check the locks, just as Keanu had asked. The courtyard was quiet, except for the whisper of wind brushing against the metal fence. He was halfway to the gate when it happened. A single, sharp sound split the air. Metal rang. He ducked instinctively. A moment later, he saw it. A small dent near the top of the gate, still smoking faintly in the moonlight. A bullet. His breath caught in his throat. He looked toward the street, but whoever had fired was already gone. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, suffocating. Keanu appeared seconds later, barefoot, flashlight in hand. Mateo, he called. Are you hurt? Mateo shook his head, his voice unsteady. It hit the gate. Keanu knelt beside him, examining the mark. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly and looked up at the stars. They're trying to scare us, he said softly. They think fear will do what bullets can't. He turned to Mateo, his tone steady. Go wake the others. We need to talk. Minutes later, everyone gathered in the courtyard again, some still half asleep. Keanu stood in front of the gate, the dent visible behind him in the flashlight's glow. The boys stared at it in silence. Keanu's voice was calm but firm. No one got hurt tonight. That's what matters. But we can't pretend this didn't happen. We'll increase security starting tomorrow. Luis will handle the new locks, and I'll speak with the local police. Diego's jaw tightened. We should fight back. Show them we're not afraid. Keanu shook his head. No. Violence ends when someone chooses not to return it. If we respond with anger, we become the thing we're trying to change. The group fell silent. Even Diego had no reply. Keanu looked at each of them in turn. You are the proof that change is possible. Don't let anyone pull you back into the darkness. Mateo's heart steadied as he watched him. The fear hadn't disappeared, but something stronger had taken its place: conviction. By morning, the news of the bullet had spread quietly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors looked away when passing the gate, afraid to be associated. Others dropped by with soft words and nervous glances. Rosa stayed close to the kitchen, her eyes sharper than usual, watching every shadow beyond the fence. Yet through it all, Keanu remained composed, moving through the day as if nothing had changed. He met with Luis to install new locks and stronger lighting around the perimeter. He contacted the police, who promised to send patrol cars by more often, though no one expected much from that. The system was stretched thin, and everyone knew that fear often made officials turn their eyes away. In the afternoon, Keanu called everyone together again. They gathered by the wall of doves, now glowing under the afternoon Sunday. What happened last night, he began, wasn't just a warning for me. It was a warning for what we stand for. They want to see if we'll back down, so we're going to answer, but not with fear. He looked around at the group, his tone steady and sincere. I'm not asking you to ignore danger. I'm asking you to remember why you're here. You came to build, to change, to learn who you can be without violence. That hasn't changed. Mateo listened intently, nodding to himself. His eyes drifted to the mark on the gate in the distance, a small dent that now seemed to represent something larger, the weight of everything they were fighting for. Keanu continued, his voice softer now. If we're going to last, we must be stronger inside than the world outside. Fear wins when we let it decide for us. But courage is quiet. It's getting up the next morning and still choosing hope. A long silence followed. Then, one of the younger boys raised his hand and asked, "What if they come back, Keanu? What if they try again?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Then we'll still be here, and we'll still bake bread. We'll still fix cars. We'll still paint doves. because no one, not even them, can take away the peace we make with our own hands." The boys looked at one another, something shifting between them. Fear was still there, but it had lost its power. It no longer dictated who they were. That night, after everyone went to bed, Keanu walked to the gate alone. He ran his fingers over the bullet mark, then took a piece of white chalk and drew around it a simple outline, shaped like a dove. He stood back and whispered, "You tried to break us, but now you're part of our wall." When morning came, the boys saw it and smiled. Even Rosa, who had worried more than anyone, laughed softly and said, "Leave it there. It tells the truth." From that day forward, that small white chalk dove stayed on the gate. It reminded everyone that even a wound could become a message of peace. The afternoon sun was harsh and golden, spilling across the courtyard of Casa Nueva Vida. Inside the main hall, Keanu stood with half a dozen students for their weekly acting class. They were rehearsing a scene about forgiveness, something Keanu had written himself. The boys laughed nervously as they stumbled through their lines, their accents thick, their energy pure and hopeful. "Remember," Keanu said, smiling, "acting isn't pretending. It's telling the truth in front of people who stopped listening." Mateo raised his hand. "What if they never listen?" Keanu nodded. "Then you speak louder with your heart, not your voice." Before he could say more, a sharp sound echoed through the air. Tires screeched. The laughter vanished instantly. Through the open windows, they saw a line of black trucks pulling up to the gate. Doors slammed. Men stepped out 10, maybe 12 of them. Their faces were hard, eyes hidden by dark sunglasses. Rosa, who had been baking in the kitchen, ran to the window and froze. "Keanu," she whispered, "they're armed." Everything inside the center stopped moving. Diego instinctively reached for a wrench from the workshop. Mateo stepped forward, but Keanu raised his hand. "No one moves," he said calmly. "Stay where you are." He walked to the courtyard door, every step deliberate. When he pushed it open, the sunlight poured in, blinding for a second. The armed men stood just beyond the gate. The leader, tall with tattoos creeping up his neck, motioned for the gate to be opened. Keanu walked slowly toward them. His hands were visible, palms open. "This is private property," he said quietly. "If you have something to say, say it." The leader took a step forward. His presence was commanding, heavy with the kind of authority born from fear. "You must be Keanu Reeves," he said, his voice low and coarse. "They call me Rafa." Keanu studied him carefully. The name was familiar. Rafa had once been a major figure in the area, running operations that pulled in dozens of young men, the same ones now building cars and baking bread inside these walls. Rafa tilted his head. "You've got some nerve, Hollywood. Taking my people, teaching them to bake, to play, pretend." Keanu's tone didn't change. "They're not yours," he said. "They never were." Rafa's eyes hardened. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You're stealing my soldiers, my business. You're breaking the chain that feeds families mine, theirs, everyone's." Keanu shook his head. "I'm breaking the chain that kills them." Behind him, the students watched from the doorway, fear and disbelief mixing in their eyes. Mateo took a step closer, ready to intervene, but Keanu gave a small signal for him to stay back. Rafa circled slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You talk like a saint, but you're just another rich man playing savior." Keanu didn't react. His voice stayed soft but carried weight. "You lost them the day you stopped giving them a future." The words landed like stones in the silence. Some of Rafa's men shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking toward the boys in the doorway. They knew those faces. Some had grown up together. Rafa's jaw tightened. "You think words fix this?" Keanu met his gaze without blinking. "No." But they stopped the bleeding long enough for change to start. Rafa's hand twitched near his belt, not to draw, but to remind everyone he could. Then, after a long pause, he spat on the ground at Keanu's feet. "This isn't over," he said. "You've started something you can't control." Keanu didn't move. Then I'll finish it by saving whoever's left. Rafa's men tensed, waiting for a signal that never came. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the palm trees beyond the gate. Keanu stood still, his expression unreadable, but his calmness unsettled them more than any show of fear could have. Mateo's heart pounded in his chest as he watched from the doorway. Every instinct screamed to run forward, to protect the man who had given him a second chance. But something in Keanu's posture, the quiet steadiness of it, told him not to move. Rafa finally broke the silence. You think you can build a wall high enough to keep me out? You can't. These boys belong to the streets. It's who they are. Keanu's eyes softened. No one belongs to the streets. They were only there because no one else opened a door. The line hit harder than a weapon. Even some of Rafa's men looked away, guilt flickering in their faces. Rafa noticed it too, and it only fueled his anger. He took a step closer, pointing a finger at Keanu's chest. You want to play hero? Fine. But when one of them dies, it'll be on you. Keanu's voice dropped lower. When one of them dies, it'll be because too many people stayed silent. I won't be one of them. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the air thick with the tension of two opposing worlds. Then Rafa turned abruptly, snapping his fingers. His men backed away toward the trucks. Before getting in, Rafa looked back one last time. You're brave, Hollywood, but bravery gets buried fast in this city. The engines roared to life, and the convoy pulled away, leaving behind dust and the smell of gasoline. The silence afterward felt deafening. Keanu exhaled slowly and turned to face the courtyard. The boys were still frozen at the door. It's over, he said gently. Go back inside. Mateo approached first. Keanu, he'll come back. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we'll meet him again with the same thing we met him with today, peace. That night, no one slept easily. But as the lights dimmed across Casa Nueva Vida, Keanu looked out from his window toward the gate where Rafa had stood. The dirt still bore the mark of his spit, but above it, the chalk dough from the night before remained untouched. He whispered to himself, they can threaten us all they want, but they can't touch what's already free. The night began in silence. The desert air was cool, the stars sharp and endless over Casa Nueva Vida. Inside the compound, most of the boys were asleep. The lights in the courtyard flickered weakly as the last few volunteers finished cleaning the kitchen. Mateo stayed up late again, tinkering with an engine in the garage. He liked the quiet hours, when the world seemed calm, when the noise in his head finally settled. He was wiping his hands when he caught the faint smell of something burning. At first, he thought it was the old wiring in the wall. Then the smell grew thicker chemical, wrong. He stepped outside, scanning the shadows. In the far corner of the courtyard, behind the garage door, a faint orange light began to pulse. Fire! He shouted, his voice breaking through the stillness. Within seconds, smoke poured from the cracks in the garage door. Flames licked upward, devouring the wooden shelves stacked with paint cans and fuel containers. Mateo ran toward it, shouting for help. The others burst out of their rooms, half-dressed, eyes wide with panic. Get the buckets! Diego yelled, sprinting toward the well. Keanu appeared moments later, barefoot, his face tense but calm. Everyone out of the building, he ordered, coughing through the smoke. Mateo, how many were inside? 2, Mateo gasped. They were working with me, in the back. Keanu didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wet cloth from Rosa, wrapped it around his mouth, and pushed into the fire. The heat slammed against him like a wall, but he kept going, shouting through the smoke. Where are you? A weak voice answered from the back. Here, help! Keanu found one of the boys pinned under a fallen shelf. He lifted it with his shoulder, pain tearing through his muscles, and pulled the boy free. The air burned his throat, but he didn't stop. Another boy stumbled out behind him, coughing violently. Outside, Mateo and Diego doused the flames with buckets of water, their arms shaking. The fire hissed and roared, fighting every attempt to tame it. Keanu staggered out of the smoke, dragging the last boy with him. The students surrounded them, slapping water on his shirt to extinguish the sparks that clung to the fabric. When the flames finally died, the garage stood blackened and broken. The smell of ash and melted rubber filled the air. Keanu sat on the ground, his chest heaving, soot covering his face. The rescued boys leaned against him, coughing, but alive. Rosa dropped to her knees beside them, tears in her eyes. "You could have died," she whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly. "They could have," he said. "That's what mattered." The fire trucks arrived late, sirens wailing long after the worst was over. The firefighters surveyed the scene, their faces grim. One of them muttered, "This wasn't an accident." Mateo heard him and clenched his fists. "They did this," he said, his voice trembling. "Rafa's people." Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But tonight, we're alive. That's all that matters." The boys looked at him, waiting for anger, for rage, but there was none, only resolve. By dawn, the courtyard was covered in a gray layer of ash. Smoke still curled gently from the charred remains of the garage. The smell of burnt wood and fuel clung to the air, seeping into clothes, into skin. The boys stood together, silent, staring at the damage. The place that had become their home looked wounded, fragile, but still standing. Keanu emerged from his room with bandages on his forearms and a hoarse voice, but his steps were steady. He walked straight to the garage, stopping in front of the blackened doorway. Mateo and Diego joined him, their faces streaked with soot. No one spoke at first. Finally, Mateo said softly, "We should close down for a while. Let things cool off." Keanu turned to face him. His expression was tired, but there was no defeat in his eyes. "If we close," he said, "then they win. And we didn't build this place to lose." Rosa came forward, her apron still stained from the night before. "The neighbors are scared, Keanu," she said. "They think the fire was a warning. Maybe it's time to stop." Keanu looked around at everyone gathered: Luis, Rosa, the students who had risked their lives with buckets and bare hands. He raised his voice just enough for all to hear. "I know what you're thinking, but this fire didn't destroy us. It showed us what we're made of." He took a deep breath. "Fear says stop. Hope says rebuild. And I'm choosing hope." The silence stretched for a moment. Then Diego stepped forward and said, "Then I choose it too." Mateo nodded. "Me too." One by one, the others joined them. Soon, every person stood shoulder to shoulder, soot on their faces, eyes filled with something unshakable. Keanu extended his hand. Mateo took it first, then Diego, then Rosa, until they were all linked together. "We rebuild," Keanu said quietly. "Together." The sun broke over the horizon then, casting gold across the courtyard. Its light touched the wall of doves, and even through the smoke, the colors still shone. The fire hadn't erased them. It had only darkened the edges, like a frame around something unbreakable. By afternoon, work had already begun. Hammers rang again. New wood replaced what had burned. The younger students shoveled debris, while others cleaned the tools that had survived. Rosa handed out food and water, her eyes full of pride. When a local reporter came by and asked Keanu if he would rebuild after what happened, he didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. "Flames can burn walls, but they can't burn purpose." The story spread by evening. Across town, people who had doubted the center now called it a miracle. Donations arrived. Volunteers appeared. And that night, for the first time since the fire, the laughter returned, quieter, humbler, but real. Keanu stood at the gate, the smell of ash still heavy, and whispered to himself, "They tried to scare us. Instead, they reminded us why we're here." The weeks after the fire changed everything. The rebuilding drew attention far beyond Mexicali. Word spread through local radio stations, then newspapers, until one morning, a documentary journalist from Mexico City arrived at Casa Nueva Vida. Her name was Ana Morales, and she introduced herself with a handshake and a promise. "I'm not here for scandal," she said to Keanu. "I'm here for truth." Keanu agreed to let her film. He had turned down most interviews, but something in Anna's sincerity convinced him this one might matter. She followed him around the center for 2 days, her camera capturing everything: the boys baking bread, Mateo fixing engines, Diego leading acting warm-ups. She filmed Rosa stirring soup and laughing with the younger ones. She caught small moments that told the larger story, hope stitched together from the ashes of loss. On the third morning, Anna asked if she could record a short interview in the courtyard. The wall of doves gleamed behind them in the sunlight, each color vivid against the white. The boys gathered quietly around, curious. Anna began simply. "Keanu, everyone knows you as an actor, a star. But what brought you here?" He paused for a long moment before answering. "People think fame fills the holes in your life," he said. "But the truth is, purpose does. I came here looking for meaning. I found it in them." Anna nodded, glancing at her camera operator. "And after everything that's happened, the threats, the fire, what keeps you going?" Keanu looked toward the boys, who were listening in silence. "Because if you're really strong," he said softly, "help them instead of dragging them down." The courtyard went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. His words weren't rehearsed. They came from somewhere deeper, shaped by every scar and every lesson. Anna lowered her microphone. "That's it," she whispered to her cameraman. "That's the heart of it." After the interview, Keanu didn't think much of it. They thanked Anna and returned to work. The students resumed painting the new workshop walls. Rosa handed out bread, still warm from the oven. The center moved forward as it always did, with hands, hearts, and humility. But that night, something unexpected happened. Anna uploaded a short clip from the interview to her social media account. The video was only 20 seconds long. Keanu's quiet face, the wall of doves behind him, and his voice saying, "If you're really strong, help them instead of dragging them down." By morning, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. Within a week, it had been shared by celebrities, human rights groups, and news networks across the world. The hashtag number Casa Nueva Vida began trending globally. Mateo was the first to notice. He ran into the courtyard holding his phone. "Keanu, look!" he shouted. "You're everywhere." Keanu frowned. "Everywhere." Mateo handed him the phone. The screen showed his face frozen mid-sentence with the caption, "Strength isn't control, it's compassion." Beneath it, hundreds of thousands of comments flooded in from people saying how his words had changed the way they saw strength. Rosa leaned over his shoulder and smiled. "The world finally sees what we already knew." The following days felt unreal. Reporters began arriving at the gates, not with suspicion this time, but admiration. Donations poured in from across the world: tools, computers, clothing, even musical instruments. A group of engineers from Los Angeles sent new workshop equipment. Keanu's friends in Hollywood quietly contributed too, but he asked that their names remain private. "Let the light fall on the work," he said, "not the people behind it." The students could hardly believe what was happening. One morning, Mateo walked into class holding a newspaper that showed a photo of the wall of doves on the front page. The headline read, "Strength is compassion, Reeves inspires a generation." He looked at Keanu with pride. "You did it," he said. Keanu shook his head gently. "No, we did it." The center began to transform. With the new funding, they built a small library, added more classrooms, and expanded the bakery to serve the local community. For the first time, Casa Nueva Vida wasn't just a refuge, it was a symbol. People came from all over Mexico to volunteer, some staying for weeks, some for months. Even those who once doubted now stopped by with food or money, offering shy smiles instead of suspicion. One evening, Ana Morales returned. Her documentary was nearly complete, but she wanted to capture one last moment. She set up her camera as the students performed a short play they had written themselves, a story about forgiveness and rebuilding after pain. The performance ended with all of them standing before the mural, their voices joining together to say the line Keanu had made famous, "If you're really strong, help them instead of dragging them down." When the applause faded, Anna asked, How does it feel to know the world is listening to you now? Keanu looked around at the courtyard, at the laughter, the smell of bread, the paint still fresh on the wall, and smiled. It feels like they're not listening to me, he said. They're listening to them. That night, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the courtyard filled with music and celebration. The students danced, Rosa laughed, and Luis played guitar. For a moment, there was no past, no fear, no shadow of what they had survived, only life, pure and full. Later, as the laughter quieted and the lights dimmed, Mateo found Keanu standing by the gate, gazing at the glowing mural. It's different now, Mateo said softly. Keanu nodded. Yes, but the message stays the same. We build, piece one act at a time. They stood in silence as a gentle wind stirred the air. The wall of doves shimmered beneath the moonlight, each one a story, a struggle, and a second chance. And somewhere far beyond that small courtyard, millions of strangers repeated his words again and again. If you're really strong, help them, instead of dragging them down. The morning began like any other. The air was thick with the smell of bread baking, engines humming in the workshop, and laughter echoing across the courtyard. The center was thriving again. The boys had new uniforms, new tools, and new dreams. Casa Nueva Vida had survived fire, fear, and doubt. But there was one story still unfinished, the man who had once tried to destroy it. Rafa hadn't been seen in months. His name had become more of a shadow than a presence. Some said he left the city. Others claimed he'd been arrested, or worse. But on a warm afternoon, as the students worked on a mural near the front gate, a figure appeared on the road. A man, walking alone, hands in his pockets, wearing no mask, no weapon. Mateo spotted him first. Keanu, he called softly, you'd better come see this. Keanu stepped out from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw who it was, he paused. Rafa walked slowly toward the gate, his head slightly lowered. His face looked older, the sharp arrogance replaced with something quieter, heavier. He stopped a few feet from the entrance. You gonna let me in? Keanu nodded once. If you came without anger, the door's open. Rafa stepped inside. The air seemed to shift. Some of the boys stopped what they were doing, watching him warily. Diego, who was changing a tire near the corner, froze completely. His wrench clattered to the ground. Rafa, Keanu said gently. You know him? Diego swallowed hard. He's my brother. The courtyard went silent. Even the sound of the oven timer ringing in the kitchen felt distant. Rafa glanced toward Diego, surprise flickering in his eyes. You're still here, he muttered. Didn't think this place would keep you. Diego's jaw tightened. It did more than keep me. It changed me. Rafa said nothing, his eyes darting between Keanu and his brother. I came to talk, he said finally. Just talk. Keanu nodded. Then let's walk. They moved toward the edge of the courtyard, away from the others. The air was thick with tension, but Keanu's tone remained calm. I didn't expect to see you again, he said. Rafa's voice was low. I didn't expect to come back. He looked around, his eyes taking in the new paint, the laughter from the workshop, the smell of bread that drifted from Rosa's kitchen. You really built this out of nothing, he said, but you can't fix what's broken. Keanu met his gaze, steady and unflinching. Not alone, he said, but we can start. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the faint sounds of the boys working nearby, Diego's laughter, Mateo's voice giving directions. It was life continuing, unafraid. Rafa sighed, the sound heavy. He was supposed to be with me, he said, nodding toward Diego. He had fire. He had the streets in his blood. Keanu shook his head. He still has fire. But now it builds instead of burns. Rafa turned away, staring at the ground. And you think that's enough? You think painting walls and fixing cars changes who we are? Keanu's voice softened. No, it changes who you can be. Rafa didn't answer right away. His eyes wandered to the workshop where Diego was helping another student repair a car engine. He looked different, focused, proud, smiling without shame. For the first time in years, Rafa saw his little brother without the weight of fear in his face. Something in that sight broke the hardness in him. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low. When I was his age, I didn't get choices. It was either join or starve. No one ever told me I could be more than what I was born into. Keanu nodded. That's what we're trying to change. So no one has to make that choice again. Rafa looked at him, the anger in his eyes fading into confusion. Why you? You could have built this anywhere. You could have stayed safe. Keanu smiled faintly. Because safe doesn't help anyone. And because I've been where he's been lost, angry, alone, someone helped me once. Now it's my turn. The words lingered. Rafa studied him, searching for some trace of pride or weakness, but found none. What he saw instead was something he didn't know how to fight peace. For a long while, they stood in silence. The sounds of hammers and laughter filled the distance between them. Rosa's voice floated out from the kitchen, calling for lunch. Keanu started to turn back toward the courtyard, but Rafa stopped him. Wait, he said. You really think he's better off here? Keanu looked over his shoulder. You already know the answer. Rafa followed his gaze. Diego was wiping grease from his hands, smiling as he helped a younger boy tighten a bolt. His laugh was unguarded, real. Rafa couldn't remember the last time he'd heard it like that. He took a deep breath. If I wanted to change, where would I even start? Keanu didn't hesitate. Right where you are. For a second, Rafa almost smiled. You make it sound easy. It isn't, Keanu said, but it's possible. Rafa looked down at his arm. The tattoo that marked his old life, his loyalty to the cartel, was faded but still visible. He rolled up his sleeve, staring at it. I used to think this was who I was, he murmured. Now it just feels like a cage. Keanu's voice was quiet but certain. Then stop wearing the bars. Rafa exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. You know, you talk like a preacher. Only when someone needs reminding, Keanu replied. For the first time, Rafa laughed a rough, uncertain sound, but genuine. He looked toward the gate where he'd once stood armed and furious, and shook his head. You've got guts, Hollywood. Keanu extended his hand. No, just faith. Rafa looked at it for a long moment, then clasped it firmly. Keep him safe, he said, glancing toward Diego. I will, Keanu promised, but he's already saving himself. Rafa nodded, then turned to leave. He walked slowly toward the road, the afternoon sun glinting off his skin. When he reached the gate, he paused and pulled off his jacket. For the first time, he left his old gang tattoo uncovered, exposed to the light. Mateo and Diego watched him go in silence. He didn't hide it, Mateo said quietly. No, Keanu replied. Maybe he doesn't have to anymore. And as Rafa disappeared down the dusty road, the courtyard filled again with the sound of laughter, the kind that meant something had quietly changed forever. Months had passed since Rafa's visit, and Casa Nueva Vida had entered a new chapter. The once broken garage now stood rebuilt, brighter and stronger than before. The wall of doves stretched farther than anyone ever imagined, each bird painted by hands that once trembled with anger, but now worked with purpose. Mateo had grown into a quiet leader. His days started before sunrise, helping Rosa set up breakfast and checking that every workshop was ready. The new recruits, boys, barely 15, looked up to him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had become what Keanu had always hoped for, proof that redemption wasn't a dream, but a choice made daily. In the workshop, he guided a small group as they worked on an old pickup engine donated by a farmer. No shortcuts, he reminded them, leaning over the hood. Patience builds trust, and trust builds everything else. One of the younger boys, Pablo, looked up. Is that something Keanu taught you? Mateo smiled. He taught me to build engines. Life taught me the rest. Later that afternoon, when the work was done, Mateo found Keanu by the courtyard wall, cleaning brushes from the latest mural project. The air smelled of fresh paint and tortillas baking. Mateo hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Got a minute?" Keanu turned, his hands still stained with blue paint. "For you?" "Always." They sat on a low bench near the fountain. The sound of water mixed with the distant laughter of the boys. Mateo looked down at his calloused hands. "There's something I never told you," he began. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Keanu stayed silent, giving him space. "When I first came here," Mateo said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't planning to stay. I came because someone told me you kept cash in your office. I planned to rob you and disappear." The words hung in the air. Mateo's throat tightened. "But then you shook my hand. You called me by my name. No one had done that in years." Keanu didn't speak right away. He just looked at Mateo, really looked at him with the same calm that had carried the center through every storm. Then he smiled. "Then, you've already proven change is real." Mateo blinked, his voice breaking. "You're not angry?" "Why would I be?" Keanu said gently. "That boy you're talking about doesn't exist anymore." The emotion Mateo had held back for years finally cracked open. He leaned forward, and Keanu wrapped an arm around him. The embrace wasn't dramatic or long. It was simple, human, full of understanding. When they pulled apart, Keanu said, "You remind me of someone I used to be, and that's the best compliment I can give." Mateo laughed through his tears. "Guess that means I'm on the right track." "More than you know," Keanu said. "Now it's your turn to lead." The next week, Casa Nueva Vida received an invitation from a nearby high school. The principal had heard about the center and wanted one of its students to speak at an assembly about second chances. Keanu immediately thought of Mateo. When he told him, Mateo froze. "Me? Talk in front of a crowd?" Keanu smiled. "You don't have to be perfect, just be honest." On the day of the event, the entire center gathered to cheer him on. Rosa handed him a neatly pressed shirt. Diego fixed his collar, teasing, "Don't forget to smile." Keanu simply placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Speak from your heart," he said. "That's the only script you need." The auditorium was packed. Students filled the seats, teachers lined the walls, and the sound of chatter echoed like thunder. Mateo stood backstage, clutching the folded paper of his notes. He took a deep breath, remembering the first day he walked into the center, scared, angry, and ready to run. Now he was about to tell the world how he stayed. When the principal introduced him, applause rippled through the hall. Mateo stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded him for a moment, but then he spotted Keanu in the front row, arms crossed, smiling with quiet pride. He began softly. "My name is Mateo," he said, his accent thick but steady. "And a year ago, I didn't believe in anything. Not in hope, not in kindness, not even in myself." The room went silent. "I grew up in a place where survival meant hurting people before they hurt you. I thought that was strength. But then I met a man who showed me what real strength looks like. He told me something I'll never forget. If you're really strong, help them instead of dragging them down." Gasps and murmurs filled the air. The words were familiar Keanu's viral quote. Hearing it spoken by the very boy it had saved gave it new power. Mateo continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "I came to his center to steal from him. Instead, he gave me a life. He didn't see a thief. He saw someone who could build instead of break." A teacher in the front row wiped her eyes. Students leaned forward, listening to every word. "Now, I help teach younger kids who remind me of myself," Mateo said. "And every time they doubt, I tell them what Keanu told me, that change isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose." He paused, his eyes glistening. "So, if you ever feel like you've gone too far down the wrong road, just remember, there's always another turn." When he finished, the silence lasted only a heartbeat before the entire room rose to its feet. The applause was thunderous. Some students cheered. Others cried. Even the principal clapped until his hands turned red. Keanu stayed seated, smiling quietly, his eyes shining. To him, the applause wasn't just for Mateo, it was for every boy who had chosen light over darkness. After the assembly, students surrounded Mateo, asking questions, shaking his hand, calling him an inspiration. He blushed, overwhelmed, but proud. When the crowd thinned, Keanu approached him. "You did it," Keanu said. Mateo shook his head, smiling. "No, we did it." They walked outside together, into the sunlight. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the distance, somewhere between the past and the future. Mateo looked at the sky and said softly, "You know, I used to think redemption meant forgetting who you were." Keanu nodded. "It doesn't. It means remembering and still choosing better." They stood there for a long moment, side by side. One had found purpose through compassion. The other had found freedom through faith. And behind them, unseen but alive in every heart that heard their story, Casa Nueva Vida kept growing one act of hope at a time. The morning of the grand reopening was warm and bright, the kind of day that felt touched by grace. The courtyard of Casa Nueva Vida was transformed. Rows of white chairs stretched across the open space, decorated with ribbons and fresh flowers donated by the local community. The wall of doves gleamed in the sunlight, newly restored after the fire, its colors more vibrant than ever. Keanu stood near the entrance, watching the crowd gather. There were government officials, reporters, teachers, and families from all over Mexicali. Parents held the hands of young children. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they looked around, seeing what had risen from ashes. Rosa moved through the guests with trays of fresh bread, her laughter filling the air. Mateo stood at the front, wearing a clean white shirt and a nervous smile. Diego and Luis adjusted the microphone, while a group of students rehearsed their short speeches behind the curtain of the small stage. The entire center was buzzing with energy and pride. Keanu checked his watch, but instead of stepping toward the podium as the organizer had asked him to, he shook his head. "Not me," he told Rosa softly. "This is their day." When the event began, the crowd fell silent. A city official stepped up to the microphone first, giving a brief introduction. "What began as one man's idea has become a movement," he said. "A place where broken lives find purpose. Today, we celebrate not just a building, but a rebirth." Applause filled the courtyard. Then, the official turned toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, would you like to say a few words before we begin?" Keanu shook his head gently. "They'll speak for me," he said, nodding toward the students. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd as Mateo approached the stage first. His voice trembled at the start but steadied as he continued. "A year ago," he said, "most of us here didn't believe in second chances. We were angry, scared, and lost. But someone showed us that strength isn't about power. It's about kindness." The audience listened in silence, many leaning forward. Rosa wiped her eyes as she watched from the side. Then one by one, the students came forward to share their stories. Diego spoke about growing up surrounded by violence and how Casa Nueva Vida helped him find peace. Pablo shared how fixing cars had taught him patience and pride. Another boy, Javier, said he'd never believed he could read a full book until he helped build the center's new library. Each voice added a layer to the story, raw and honest, filled with pain but also hope. The crowd responded not with polite applause, but with genuine emotion. Some stood, others cried openly. Finally, Mateo returned to the microphone. The sun caught his face as he looked over the crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "We used to be called criminals, dropouts, mistakes," he said. "But we're no longer statistics. We're stories. We're builders. We're proof that love can do what violence never could." The applause that followed was thunderous. Even the officials who had come with skepticism found themselves standing, clapping, until their hands ached. Mateo stepped back, his chest heaving, overwhelmed by the moment. Keanu stayed in the back, his head bowed slightly, eyes wet. He hadn't needed to speak. The boys had spoken for him, louder than any speech he could have written. As the applause finally softened, The city official stepped back to the microphone and announced, "And now, for the ribbon-cutting Mr. Reeves, this honor belongs to you." The crowd turned toward Keanu, who still stood quietly near the back. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing against the courtyard tiles. When he reached the front, the official handed him the ceremonial scissors, polished and gleaming. Keanu took them, looked at them for a long second, then turned to Mateo. "This doesn't belong to me," he said softly. "It belongs to you," the crowd murmured as Keanu handed the scissors to him. Mateo's eyes widened. "Me?" Keanu nodded. "You rebuilt this place. You led. You believed, so you open it." The courtyard fell silent as Mateo stepped toward the red ribbon stretched across the new archway. His hand trembled slightly as he raised the scissors, the metal glinting in the sunlight. Behind him stood Diego, Rosa, and dozens of others who had once been lost but were now whole again. He glanced back at Keanu, who gave a small nod. Then, with one decisive snip, the ribbon fell. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the courtyard erupted in applause so loud it seemed to shake the walls. People stood, clapping and cheering, some shouting Mateo's name. Rosa hugged Diego, crying openly. Luis wiped his eyes and muttered, "We did it." Keanu stepped back, letting the moment belong entirely to them. He watched as the students led guests through the workshops, proudly showing their rebuilt spaces. The bakery gave out warm loaves of bread stamped with a small dove symbol. The library filled with laughter as children ran between the shelves. Everywhere Keanu looked, he saw pieces of their journey. The bullet mark on the gate still traced with white chalk, the painted wall that had survived the fire, the mural that now included Rafa's brother Diego holding a hammer in one hand and a dove in the other. A reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Reeves, why did you give the honor to your student?" Keanu smiled gently. "Because this was never about me. It's about what happens when someone believes they're worth saving. You give that belief to enough people, and they start believing it themselves." The reporter lowered her microphone slowly. Around them, the sound of music began: guitars, laughter, voices blending together. The courtyard glowed with joy. As the sun began to set, Mateo found Keanu, standing near the gate again, hands in his pockets, quietly watching. "You really didn't want to cut it?" he asked. Keanu shook his head with a smile. "I already did, a long time ago. The ribbon was between who you were and who you are now. You're the one who crossed it." Mateo looked back at the crowd, at the life they had built. "Then I guess we all did." Keanu nodded. "Yes, you did." And the world noticed. The applause rose again in the distance, and as the orange light washed over them both, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The weeks after the grand reopening marked the beginning of something even larger than anyone expected. What had started as a single center in Mexicali now drew people from all over the world. The story of Casa Nueva Vida spread through newspapers, television, and social media, reaching places far beyond Mexico's borders. The first to arrive were educators. Professors from universities in the United States and South America came to study the model. They walked through the workshops, took notes, and asked endless questions about the teaching methods. Keanu always welcomed them with humility. "It's not a miracle," he told them. "It's just consistency, love, and accountability. The things everyone deserves." Soon after, actors and musicians began visiting. Some came quietly, without cameras, wanting to understand what Keanu had built. A few brought instruments and performed impromptu concerts for the students in the courtyard. One afternoon, a famous singer sat beside Rosa in the kitchen, helping her knead dough while laughing at her Spanish lessons. The sight became a symbol of what the center stood for: fame humbling itself to serve. Reporters filled the courtyard again, but this time there were no accusations, no skepticism. Every story they wrote echoed the same sentiment. Casa Nueva Vida wasn't about saving people, it was about helping them save themselves. Matteo handled most of the tours now. He spoke fluently about the programs, showing visitors how the students learned to repair engines, bake bread, and act in plays. The younger recruits watched him with admiration. In every gesture, he reflected the lessons Keanu had once given him: patience, humility, and faith in small progress. The Mexican Ministry of Education took notice. Within months, they announced a plan to replicate Casa Nueva Vida in 5 more cities across the country. They asked Keanu to attend the signing ceremony in Mexico City. When the invitation arrived, Rosa nearly cried with pride. "You have to go," she said. "You started this." Keanu smiled softly. "Then I should send someone who will finish it." He sent Matteo instead. When the cameras rolled at the ceremony, it was Matteo who stood before the microphones, speaking on behalf of the program. "This isn't about one man," he said. "It's about thousands of us learning to live again. What we built in Mexicali can be built anywhere, because hope doesn't belong to one city. It belongs to everyone." The clip spread quickly, just like Keanu's words once had. Within days, foundations in Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina reached out, asking for help to start similar programs. A new movement was born, one that didn't depend on fame or politics, but on example. Through it all, Keanu stayed in Mexicali. He refused interviews that focused on him, turning every question toward the young people. When one reporter asked, "How does it feel to be the face of a global movement?" he smiled and said, "I'm not the face, I'm just one of the hands." Those words became another quote shared across the world. But for Keanu, it wasn't about words. It was about actions, the daily ones that mattered most. He still swept the floors in the morning, helped Rosa serve meals, and spent evenings talking quietly with new arrivals who were scared to believe in change. One night, as the courtyard lights glowed, softly, Matteo approached him with a newspaper. The headline read, "Casa Nueva Vida, to expand across Latin America." Matteo grinned. "You know what this means?" Keanu looked up from the engine he was repairing and said simply, "It means we've got more work to do." As months passed, the movement grew faster than anyone had imagined. Community leaders from across Latin America visited Mexicali to learn how compassion could replace fear. In Guatemala, a small group of volunteers opened their own Casa Nueva Vida, using the same symbol, the dove, and the words, "strength through kindness." In Colombia, a former teacher started a workshop for ex-gang members. Inspired by Matteo's story, Keanu began receiving invitations from global conferences, universities, and humanitarian organizations. Some even offered awards and honorary titles, but he accepted only one invitation to speak at a youth forum in Mexico City. Reporters crowded the hall, waiting for a speech about success or celebrity philanthropy. Instead, they got something else entirely. Keanu stood at the podium in a plain shirt and jeans, his voice calm and steady. "People keep asking how we did it," he began. "The truth is simple. We didn't fix people, we believed in them until they could fix themselves." He paused, scanning the audience. "Hope doesn't need fame. It needs action. It needs patience. It needs someone willing to stand in the fire and stay there until others walk out safely." The room fell silent. Cameras clicked, but no one dared interrupt. Then, as he stepped away from the microphone, the audience rose in applause. Slow at first, then thunderous. That clip, just 30 seconds long, became another viral moment. Across the world, people began repeating his words as a call to serve rather than watch. Back in Mexicali, life at the center continued unchanged. Keanu refused to move into the new office that the government had offered him. He still shared lunch with the students, still walked the perimeter at night, and still called each boy by name. To him, fame was a distraction. Purpose was enough. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Rosa found him painting a new sign above the gate. The letters read, "Casa Nueva Vida, a movement of hands, not heroes." She watched quietly for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever stop?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Not while there's still someone who needs to start." The next morning, buses arrived from across the country, carrying volunteers ready to train. Matteo stood at the entrance, greeting them proudly. The courtyard filled once again with new faces, new laughter, and the sound of hammers striking rhythmically, a promise echoing into the future. And from that little corner of Mexicali, the message Keanu had planted kept moving outward, spreading not through fame, but through hearts willing to build where others had given up. The year passed quietly, but its impact echoed loudly through every corner of Mexicali. What had once been a half-burned warehouse on the edge of town was now unrecognizable. The walls were alive with color murals painted by former students, each one telling a story of transformation. One depicted hands releasing doves into the sky. Another showed the faces of those who had once walked through the gates burdened by shame, now shining with pride. The sounds inside the center had changed too. Instead of sirens or shouting, there was music guitars strumming, laughter carrying through open windows, the rhythmic clang of tools in the mechanic's workshop. The smell of oil and bread mixed together in the air, a strange but beautiful harmony that defined Casa Nueva Vida. Mateo was now the lead instructor in the workshop. His students, many of them barely older than he had been when he arrived, looked up to him like a mentor. He carried himself differently now, shoulders back, voice steady, confidence earned through struggle. "All right," he said one morning, clapping his hands. "Today we're not just fixing engines, we're rebuilding what people thought couldn't be fixed." The boys laughed, but they understood what he meant. They'd heard him say it before it had become the unofficial motto of the workshop. In another part of the center, Rosa ran the bakery with her usual warmth and humor. The bakery had become so popular that local stores started selling their bread under the label Pan de Nueva Vida. The proceeds funded scholarships for the younger recruits. Rosa often joked, "Who would have thought these boys could bake better than the abuelas?" Even Rafa had changed. The man who once arrived armed and angry now came every week to volunteer. He helped paint walls, repair old furniture, and talk to newcomers who still carried the weight of the streets. Some of them knew his name, whispered it in disbelief. He didn't deny his past. He simply said, "Yeah, that was me, but this is who I am now." One afternoon, he and Mateo worked side by side, fixing a broken truck engine. The silence between them was easy, the kind that didn't need words. Finally, Rafa said, "You're better at this than I ever was." Mateo smiled. "I learned from your mistakes." Rafa chuckled. "Guess I should thank you for turning them into lessons." Meanwhile, Keanu was no longer at the center every day. He had stepped back quietly, allowing others to lead. He still funded the expansion, still checked in with Rosa by phone, but he wanted the place to grow without him being the focus. "It has to belong to them," he told her once. "Otherwise, it's just a project, not a legacy." Still, every few months, he would return unannounced. No cameras, no reporters, just him. Sometimes, he'd walk through the gates in the early morning before anyone noticed, taking in the sights and sounds that reminded him why he'd started. One particular morning, a year after the reopening, he arrived just as the sun began to rise. The golden light spilled across the courtyard, touching the murals, the bakery, the walls that once bore scars of fire. Everything was alive now. Everything was thriving. Keanu took a seat on a simple wooden bench near the fountain. Around him, students rushed between workshops, greeting one another with easy laughter. None of them seemed to realize he was there. He smiled. That was exactly how he wanted it. Keanu sat quietly, watching life unfold before him like a living painting. A group of boys carried wooden planks across the yard, joking as they worked. The bakery doors were open, and the smell of cinnamon bread floated through the air. A young girl, one of the new recruits, was reading poetry aloud to a small group near the fountain. Her voice was soft but confident. The center that had once been born from fear now breathed with joy. Mateo appeared from the workshop, his hands covered in grease, his face lit with a mix of pride and exhaustion. He gave instructions to his team, guiding them with patience. The same patience Keanu had once given him. Every word, every movement showed how far he had come. Keanu could almost hear echoes of their first conversation about trust and change, now carried forward through Mateo's own leadership. Across the yard, Rafa arrived carrying a box of supplies. His old tattoo, once a mark of power and pain, now seemed like a memory instead of a warning. When he caught sight of Keanu sitting quietly on the bench, he smiled faintly, nodded once, and continued toward the workshop. It was enough. Words weren't needed between them anymore. Rosa spotted Keanu next. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over, her face glowing. "You came without telling me again," she scolded playfully. "At least let me feed you before you disappear." He laughed softly. "You'll never let me forget who's really in charge here, will you?" "Of course not," she said, handing him a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "You built the house, Keanu, but they made it a home." He took a slow bite, looking out at the courtyard. Music had started again, Diego playing guitar under the shade of a tree, some students clapping along. The sound was imperfect but full of life. Keanu's eyes grew wet. "This is theirs now," he murmured. Rosa nodded. "Yes, but they'll always know who believed first." He shook his head gently. "Belief isn't something you give, it's something you awaken, and they've awakened it in each other now." The afternoon light began to fade. Keanu stood, brushing crumbs from his hands, and took one last look around. Everywhere he turned, there was motion, growth, laughter, a rhythm that no longer depended on him. He placed the empty bread cloth beside the fountain and whispered, "Thank you." Then he walked toward the gate. No one stopped him, and no one needed to. Behind him, the sounds of Casa Nueva Vida continued steady, alive, and unending. As he stepped into the street, the sun dipped low over Mexicali, painting the sky with gold and rose. And in that moment, Keanu Reeves smiled, knowing that the greatest thing he had ever built was not a place, but a future that could stand without him. The evening sun dipped low over Mexicali, casting long shadows across the courtyard of Casa Nueva Vida. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh bread, motor oil, and paint the unmistakable aroma of work and renewal. Music drifted softly from a radio inside the workshop as students laughed, their voices full of energy and life. Keanu sat on the same wooden bench he had occupied a year ago. His gaze followed the colors of the wall of doves, now stretching across the entire courtyard. There were hundreds of them, each painted by a graduate, each carrying a story of struggle and rebirth. Some had messages written in Spanish, others in English, a few in broken words that still managed to carry deep meaning. It was no longer a wall of paint. It was a living memory of every soul that had passed through those gates. As the laughter carried into the fading light, Keanu's thoughts became words, spoken not to anyone around him, but to the quiet air itself. "I came here to make a film," he said softly, his voice calm, reflective. "But instead, I found reality. Real pain, real change, real strength." People can change, but only if someone believes in them long enough to let it happen. The camera of life seemed to pan slowly across the courtyard. Rosa stood at the bakery window, handing loaves to a line of smiling families. Mateo worked beside a group of new recruits, teaching them how to rebuild a motor from scratch. Diego tuned his guitar, while children from the neighborhood gathered to listen. Even Rafa was there, leaning against a pillar, his face relaxed, his arms bare. The once feared tattoo, now just another mark among many. No longer a warning, but a reminder. Keanu's voice continued, steady and warm. "For years, I thought acting was about telling stories that inspired people. But here, I learned that the real stories don't need scripts. They live in every act of kindness, every chance given, every hand held when it would have been easier to walk away." He stood slowly, walking toward the mural. The setting sun painted his shadow across the wall of doves. His fingertips brushed the painted feathers. "Strength isn't in power," he said quietly. "It's in mercy, in the choice to forgive, in the courage to keep believing, even when the world says stop." The final moments of the day unfolded in small, beautiful vignettes, the kind that spoke louder than words. A young man repaired his first car and broke into a grin when the engine roared to life. Rosa laughed as children tried to bake and made a glorious mess of flour and joy. Two students rehearsed lines from a small play in the courtyard, performing for an audience of friends sitting on the steps. Keanu watched all of it, the life that had blossomed from ashes. His eyes reflected pride, not in himself, but in what had endured. The fire, the threats, the doubt, none of it had won. What stood before him now was proof that compassion could outlast fear. The light faded to gold as the courtyard came alive under strings of small lamps. Music began again, soft guitar chords, clapping, laughter carried by the wind. Keanu walked slowly among the people who had once looked at him with suspicion and now greeted him with warmth. Every face told a story of what hope could do when given time to grow. Mateo approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "They still talk about you every day," he said with a grin. "Some of the new kids think you're coming back to teach them acting." Keanu smiled. "Tell them they already know how to act. They've been performing the bravest role there is, being themselves." Mateo laughed, shaking his head. "Always know what to say." Keanu looked around one last time at the lights, the music, the doves glowing faintly under the lamps. "No, Mateo," he said quietly. "Now, it's your turn to speak." As he stepped back toward the gate, the sounds of Casa Nueva Vida swelled behind him. Engines, laughter, the rhythm of hammers, the melody of a community reborn. His heart felt heavy, but not with sadness. It was the kind of weight that comes from fulfillment, from knowing that what you've built no longer needs your hands to stand. He turned for a final glance. Rosa waved from the bakery, flour on her apron. Rafa gave a half smile and a small salute. Diego's guitar echoed faintly as children clapped in rhythm. And Mateo, standing in the center of it all, watched him leave, not as a student, but as an equal. As Keanu walked down the dusty road into the evening, his voice carried softly in reflection. "I've played heroes on screen, but none of them compare to the ones I've met here. These are the real heroes, the ones who rise after falling, who forgive after being broken, who build even when the world keeps tearing things down." The sound of his footsteps faded, replaced by scenes that told the rest of the story. The graduates working in local businesses, fixing cars, baking bread, mentoring others, families reunited. A classroom full of children reading under the new mural of doves, and at the center of it all, a plaque near the gate that read, "Casa Nueva Vida, founded on compassion, built by courage." The final image lingered on the wall of doves, now endless, each one painted by a hand that had once held fear. At the center of the mural, a single message was written in large letters across the top. "Help them. Don't drag them down." Keanu's voice echoed softly, one last time. No matter where you are, there's someone who needs a second chance. Give it. You'll be surprised how it changes not just them, but you. The music swelled as the planned camera of memory pulled back the courtyard, glowing in the desert dusk, the laughter rising into the night sky like prayer. Then the screen faded to black, leaving only his voice and the call to those listening. If you believe every young person deserves a second chance, share this incredible story. Would you visit a place like Casa Nueva Vida if it were near you? Tell me in the comments what hope means to you.